This week, I explore grief, something that's turned up on the podcast a number of times this year. Grief is a very natural but overlooked process that affects all of us. I explored this with Victoria Volk, who specialises in coaching and supporting people with grief, and she's also an end-of-life doula. As we find out, grief is so often narrowly associated with death. However, its impacts are far-ranging as it's the result of any loss, and we incur grief more widely than we realise. Victoria shares the 6 common myths relating to grief and how they've been shared intergenerationally and become woven into our culture, which results in a real lack of emotional discernment that's having a very real and negative impact upon all of us, and particularly our emotional literacy. Victoria's really good at breaking down the dynamics of grief and walks us through the process to release its grip. This conversation covers a lot of ground. There's a lot of emerging questions that come up, which really provides a lovely full picture in this area that affects you, me, and everyone. So enjoy Victoria. Hello and welcome back to WA Real. I'm your host, Bryn Edwards. Today I have the great pleasure of talking with Victoria Volk. Victoria, welcome to the show.
Thank you for having me. Great to be here.
You're very, very welcome. And you're all the way over in the States.
Yeah, North Dakota.
Indeed. This is the second guest in 3 weeks that we've had from the States. So it's always fun to look. As great as it is to talk to people in Western Australia, which is most of the conversations, it's awesome to reach out from time to time and use the great technology that we have.
It's a great time we live in to do just that.
So particularly this year on the podcast, I've jumped into a number of topics. One relating to death with a lovely young man called Joseph Andrin. And then just a couple of weeks ago, the topic of climate and environmental grief came up. And so grief was really something I wanted to dive into a bit more. And then I was introduced to you and I thought it'd be a great opportunity to dive into this topic a bit further, given the fact that you do a lot of work with people who are struggling with loss, through your support and coaching, as well as end-of-life doula service. So, first of all, how did you get into this?
I'm a lifelong griever. My father passed away when I was 8, and subsequently the relationship with my mother had kind of deteriorated over the years because of it. And everything's good now, but it was really rocky for most of my life. And I, because grief is cumulative and it's cumulatively negative, I had other things that happened after he passed away to me and in my life throughout the years. And in grief recovery, we kind of equate it to, as a child, you have a backpack and everything that happens to you, death of a loved one, sexual assault, poverty, losing a home, moving, all these things, loss of a pet, which is generally kind of the first loss for children often. Think of it, each loss like a rock that you put in your backpack. And so by the time we reach adulthood, we have a pretty heavy backpack, most of us, if you accumulate all those losses, right? And I had another loss that kind of just took me over the edge. Like I thought 2014, I'd closed a business. My youngest had started kindergarten, and that kind of set off this midlife crisis unraveling I had, and started to really dive into personal development because I realized, like, why do these things just keep happening to me? Like, why is there this continual theme of I feel like I was crazy, really. I mean, it was really starting to impact my health, which grief does. If it's unaddressed, it starts to take a toll on our bodies. Our body's always speaking to us energetically. And so I started to dig into personal development, and that's really kind of what set things off. And I had another loss a few years after that and realized I wasn't okay because I thought I was. I really thought I was. I had come a long way. I'd written a book, was sharing about personal development in a blog, and realized I wasn't okay, and I went online and did a search for something to find something to help me because I really wanted to feel better. And I wanted to help people as well. And I found the Grief Recovery Institute and signed up to be a trained grief recovery specialist and went through the certification you go through. I went through exactly what I take my clients through, and it changed my life. It literally changed my life. I became a Reiki master after that, which has been critical in me really understanding my own energy and how, because I'm an empath, very highly sensitive, which really helped me make sense of my childhood. Now, as an adult, I can look back at my childhood and it makes a lot of sense to me why I needed a lot of sleep, why grief was really impacting me the way it was. Um, and it really, like, everything has come full circle in the past few years.
Wow. Wow. So, so let's dive straight into it. At a top level, what is grief?
Hmm. Grief is the normal and natural reaction to loss of any kind.
Yeah.
It is anything that we wish that would have been different, better, or more. And it's the loss of hopes, dreams, and expectations. So if we look at grief in that context, it's a lot of things. It's not just the death of a loved one. And
Yeah.
that's where people really believe that someone has to die in order to grieve. And that's just not the case. And I think too, many people don't connect the dots of what's going on within them as grief. They don't look at their symptoms, their physical symptoms. You know, you can have hair loss, you can have weight loss, you can have bowel issues, which is often really common. Like, I was diagnosed with irritable bowel syndrome when I was 16. Um, you know, so it's these physical symptoms, it manifests in our bodies, but also too, we start to, if we don't address it, it can manifest in our lives outwardly. We can have angry outbursts. We can um, resort to gambling, sex addiction, or sex and love addiction. You can be addicted to shopping, drugs, alcohol, all these different things, that these behaviors that we resort to feel better, but it only makes us feel better for a short period of time. So we got to continue to do those things in order to continue to feel better, right? So we
Yeah.
continue to resort to those things to help. We think that we feel better, but it really, and then you add on shame. So many of those behaviors, there becomes a layer of shame, and that just perpetuates and creates this vicious cycle.
And just so we're clear, the difference between grief is related to loss, and shame is a highly personal thing in how we feel about ourselves. Is that correct?
Yes, yes. And we tend to
Which is
internalize that
different to
shame.
guilt. Guilt is very much related to an act, where shame is related to how we view ourselves negatively.
Yes, yep. And so I think over time, all these behaviors and these physical things that are happening with us, we don't see the world clearly. We see the world from a perspective of feeling damaged, of feeling broken.
Yeah.
And so if we can't look in the mirror and see ourselves for who we are, rather than this grief that is creating so much havoc in our lives, which again, we don't necessarily connect to grief, but of
No,
what we're experiencing.
because it become life is crazy, and like, I'm a bit nuts and all of that, and we can pass ourselves off.
Well, yeah, and people feel like, well, this is life. This is just how life is. And, crap happens and you just have to deal with it. And so there's those people too that will just stuff down and stuff down and stuff down. And they think they're dealing with it, but then everything else in their life is falling apart.
Yeah.
They could have money issues. They could, all these things. It impacts every aspect of our lives, every aspect.
Hmm. Because I think one of the things we overlook is that, without going back all Buddhist, is that suffering is a consistency of life, and with suffering we have loss, and then that like you say places a heavy burden on us. And it's not like any particular trauma or loss it ranks higher or lower on a universal register. It's just a loss or that impacts people.
Yes, because grief is unique and individual to each of us, because especially in the context of relationships, it's unique and individual. Because you can have, let's say you have a family unit, like my family, take my family, for example. When my dad passed away, we all had the same loss. My siblings and I and my mother, we all had the same loss.
Yes.
But we all experienced it very differently.
Yes.
And we all dealt with it very differently. Actually, we all dealt with it the same. We didn't talk about it. So, I mean, but these are the things that well,
the behavior was similar, but yeah.
Right. But here's the thing, the behavior is generally the same across the board. There are 6 myths of grief that we tend to learn as children, and especially like with that first loss. I mentioned first loss as a child, you lose a pet.
Yeah.
Well, don't feel bad. Don't feel bad. We'll replace the loss. So the first one is don't feel bad, and then we'll replace the loss. We'll get you a different dog. We'll get a different dog. And it's not really addressing the pain of that initial loss. It's
sweeping it under the carpet, isn't it?
Exactly. It's not really talking about it. It's not addressing the feelings of attachment that child had to that pet.
Yeah.
And so then you have grieve alone. If the child just continually is sad about this pet loss, just if you want to cry, go cry to your room. Go cry in your room.
Yeah.
And how often I've heard so many stories, even me myself. You want to cry, I'll give you something to cry about.
Yeah.
These lines that people hear, everyone knows these lines because we're all, so many of us are told this as children. Yes, because grief brings up something very uncomfortable for us. When other people are sad or anger is a big one too. Anger makes people uncomfortable. And I think anger is an unacceptable emotion. Yeah. And so we learn this as children, that we can't even express our anger. And so is it a surprise that there's so many people that just literally like abuse themselves because there's this pent up anger, or they abuse other people, right? Because they've never learned how to channel and express that. The other one is be strong, so you might have, it's this, especially, this is generally a cultural thing too. Not generally, I shouldn't say that. And where I live, it is a cultural thing, because my background is, we're German, French, German Russians came from, where I live, we actually call it the Iron Curtain. And it's you're the stoic, you don't talk about your feelings, be tough, be strong. And so that's really carried down through generations, this be strong mentality. And I think a lot of people too, I'll just use an example of a widow, a woman who loses her husband or significant other, and there's children involved. You have to be, people will say that you have to be strong for those kids, be strong for yourself, be strong for others. That's another myth. Oftentimes too, people will keep busy.
Oh yes.
That's another myth. Yeah, it's keep busy. Well, just, so you don't dwell on it. Yeah, just get back to work and just keep busy, just preoccupy yourself. Yep. So you don't think about it. Yeah, just busy yourself doing other things so you don't think about it. And everyone knows the line, time heals. Do you know the end of this sentence?
Time heals.
Might be an wounds. American thing. All wounds. Time heals. Yeah, everyone knows this. Yeah. So, and time does nothing. Time just passes. Right. So that's the last myth of grief, is time heals all wounds. People will say this, oh, it just takes time. No, it's the action we take within time that changes things. Otherwise, time just passes.
So in a strange kind of way, given the fact that we often probably implicitly link grief with death, they're probably some of the rare opportunities where it's so transparent and it's so explicit that you give yourself at least some sort of room to actually do something that's akin to a natural grieving process. Whereas all the other myriad of things that go through life that equally we grieve as we lose them, whether it's, you know, a pet, a job, a girlfriend, a boyfriend, a car, I don't know, all the other things, they're all less explicit because they're not really, well, you know, they're just part of life, or so we perceive. And so, yeah, I can imagine that we're going through these cycles of grief, or not going through the cycles, but we're attempting to go through these cycles of grief more and more often. And yet it's only when we get really big explicit things that we get even close to allowing ourselves. Would that be correct?
I would say it's an experience for many. You know, I think it's, again, I think we all have, this is my opinion, we all have that loss that kind of just like takes us over the edge.
Yes,
Like
like you said
enough is
earlier on.
enough. Yeah, like
Yeah.
enough is enough. I can't take this anymore. And we seek help.
Yes.
And but it's heartbreaking for me because I think to myself, like, oh my gosh, if I would have had this knowledge and education 20 years ago, how much suffering I could have spared myself,
Yeah.
you know, and how much differently I would have approached my life and lived my life.
So I guess reflecting on it then, a better way of saying it is, more often than not, this is chronic, not acute. It's built up over time.
It becomes, yeah. And that's the thing. We think of it as this acute event, like you said, but it becomes chronic when we don't address it. I just think when we don't address it, and the thing is that we create these stories in our minds that we are okay.
Yes.
And you know, how often do people ask you, how are you doing? I'm fine.
Yeah,
I'm fine.
I've been busy.
Yeah. But I'm fine is, we say in grief recovery, that's feelings inside not expressed.
Right.
So if someone would say that to you, I'm fine. No, how do you really feel?
Yeah.
Then you'll get the real answer.
Yeah, stop bullshitting me.
Yeah. Right. Yep.
Yeah. So what's coming through loud and clear here is almost a couple of things. One is obviously the cultural level of not being able to express these emotions, but also underneath that we become quite emotionally stunted, and our emotional literacy, let alone, you know, to even accurately describe it. And it's something I've had to work on in the last couple of years, you know, to be able to define the difference and understand the difference between grief, shame, guilt. Because before they were just one melee of stuff that I didn't like and I would push away. And so a lot of this it comes to a lack of emotional literacy, and then knowing what to do with them.
I like how you said that, emotional literacy, because I think the term emotional intelligence is kind of a buzzword now. But I like emotional literacy because, again, we don't have the language.
No.
And
or the sensitivity. Yeah.
Right. And I think that lack of sensitivity, though, comes from our own lack of addressing what's within us. Because I think once we do that, we start to see our own lives differently. We start to develop a different perspective, and we become more compassionate. And when we become more compassionate, we have more empathy. And when we have more empathy, that is the bridge for healing for people. Is because most people just want to be heard. They just want someone to listen. You don't want to be fixed, you know, because it's like you have a broken heart. You don't have a broken brain. But in grief, we feel like we are just absolutely broken. Like there's something defective about us. And that was me. But what I'm understanding now is being an empath and someone who's highly sensitive, who takes on people's emotions as my own. And I became a caretaker at a really young age of my mother's emotions. I really internalized a lot growing up and really took on other people's stuff. And
Yes.
I didn't understand that actually until very recently. Like, what, why am I getting so drained when I'm out, like out in public, and go to a mall, or I go to a shopping center or something, and I come home and I'm just like white. I actually get pain. I feel pain in the middle of my shoulder blades. And so I've had to learn how to protect my energy. And I think for empaths, especially highly sensitive people, grief is excruciating. I felt for so long that I guess I'm just here to suffer. That's really how I felt.
Yeah.
It's mentally debilitating, because you don't even, like, there's so many years that I felt like I wasn't living up to my own potential. And that's grief too. That caused me grief as well.
So I imagine a large amount of your work has been, for you personally, has been around putting boundaries in place.
Oh, absolutely. And I think that's the beauty that came out of grief recovery, is knowing, oh, I didn't have boundaries.
Yeah,
And
yeah.
I read the book Boundaries actually last year. And now I just finished another book about empaths and learning how to create boundaries, energetic boundaries, and learn. So I'm still something I'm really I'm diving more into the energetics of it right now, but it's important. It's so important.
Yeah. Because again, that's part of that subtlety, sensitivity, and discernment around what's mine, what's someone else's, and then within what's mine, how do I actually understand these feelings that are arising? Again, are they anger? Are they guilt? Are they this? Are they that? Rather than this melee of stuff.
And two, I think as children, we aren't taught that boundaries are okay.
Very true.
I use the example of, when family gets together and the child is told to, well, go give grandma a hug, or go give uncle a hug or a kiss or whatever. And the child's personal space, well, I don't want to. No, go give your grandma a hug. It's like the child's personal space isn't even, like, the child doesn't even understand they can say no. Because again, anger, saying no, these are unacceptable things as children. And it just really sets us up to become taken advantage of as adults. It really does. It really does. Become victims of, yep.
And that's very much the sort of breeding ground for codependency.
Yes.
Later on in life, lack of boundaries, wanting to please, pronounce fawn. Yes.
Absolutely. 100%.
And because we covered this off with a couple of experts last year, and then codependency then gives rise to narcissistic behavior. So it's this nasty little thing that goes on.
And what results from that? Grief.
Yes.
Grief, because your life isn't working out as you hoped. Things aren't going well. They're not. You might realize that you're being abused, like psychologically, emotionally, or even physically abused. Like, so more trauma, just more trauma.
And unless you can acknowledge that, let alone begin to express it and then hopefully release it, it's curtains. It's a circle of shit.
That is why adulthood is our childhood reenactments.
Yes.
That's my belief.
Yeah. What was it a previous guest said? He said, where are you on the bus? Are you at the front, or are you on with your hands on the driving wheel? Because if you haven't, your childish self has.
Well, and really, are you looking straight ahead, or are you looking in the rear view then too? Because oftentimes we're looking in the rear view, like what happened in the past, what's in the past, and we're not able, all this grief that we are carrying within us, we aren't able to look to the future because we're so stuck in the past. We're emotionally tied to the past. We're emotionally tied and have these emotional cords to people who hurt us, who, and you get stuck then too. It's so easy to get stuck in feeling like a victim. That is the most disempowering thing that can happen to someone, is just being stuck in that victimhood And that was me for a long time too. And it's not to discount, because I didn't ask for the stuff that happened to me. Nobody does.
Nobody ever does.
But we always have a choice in how we respond. Always.
Yeah.
And the more we know, it's like, I don't know what I don't know. And so I wanted to know why my life was like continuing with these patterns that just, I could not break out of this cycle. And I was a ragey mom too. On top of it, my kids were young. I was a ragey mom because I was so filled with anger and resentment of what, in my childhood, that it showed our kids will bring out all the ugly I think, in us, that needs to be healed. But yeah.
Actually, it's just left my mind. I'll come back to that in a minute. So how do we carry grief, if we look at it sort of physically, mentally, emotionally, and sort of energetically and spiritually, on those 4 different levels?
How do we address it, you're asking?
How do we carry it?
How do we carry it? Oh gosh.
And how are we processing it on those levels?
I think of grief as like this. It's like you have this ball and chain, right? You just have this ball and chain that you're just dragging with you. It feels heavy. It feels, you don't feel light. You don't feel, it zaps your joy. But again, you can do behaviors that bring you joy for a time. Like it might make you happy to go and drink and have fun and be merry with your friends, but then you come home at night and you're puking sick, and then this shame comes in, and so it's heavy. It's just heavy. It's this heaviness, and we bring it to our relationships. It impacts, like I said before, every aspect of our lives. And I think for me personally, I feel like it put a veil. It like basically blocks your vision of, you don't see yourself for who you are. Because how can you see yourself as a good person if you are just so full of hate towards yourself? Depending on, you could be someone who internalizes it, like you just hate on yourself, or you just are this really bitter, nasty person that, is a road rager and creates drama in every relationship they have, and is that horrible coworker you just can't escape, So it manifests differently for people, but in a lot of ways it kind of manifests the same, it's
I often find with these things, it's almost like the underlying process is the same for most people, but the subjective experience of that is always different, if that makes sense. Not everybody can reconcile the two at once, but for me, I seem to be able to see that there are patterns and underneath, but the patterns are experienced subjectively differently.
Right. We don't connect those dots. We just don't.
So I remember what I was going to ask you just before, which was, it's the beauty of a live conversation, is that as we move, because we were talking about the victim space, as we have moved from this extraordinarily stoic place that adheres to the myths of grief that you were talking about, and I think we have to recognize we are moving some way towards more openly and culturally expressing emotions that are going on. As we move to almost like that acknowledge and express part, before we've got to the release part, as that has become slightly more accessible, is that part of what fuels this? I see almost like a proliferation of the people inhabiting the victim space. And so it's almost like we've moved that first bit to acknowledge and express what's going on, but then are we ready for the next step, which is releasing? And often we can circle and go round and round in that place because we can now express it, which is awesome, but you're not finishing the journey. So it's spiraling. And now we're in the victim space, where before we were in almost like this denial space. Now we're in a victim space before we move on. Is that sort of what you see?
Absolutely. Yes. I do think we each of us has our own walk of grief. Like it's gonna, that time is gonna be different for everybody. But I think the fallacy, or this people have this idea that, well, this is just how it is. Like, this is just how I'm going to feel for the rest of my life. That is where these ideas and thoughts are perpetuated when we get into an environment that doesn't foster moving forward, that doesn't bring any sort of action step or anything. And so exactly what you're saying, I see it online, and it's heartbreaking. It literally breaks my heart, because I actually have to I can't follow certain accounts, because it's like, you don't have to be stuck in this. You just don't. Like, it's never too soon and it's never too late. I was stuck in that for over 30 years. And it's like, that's what just breaks my heart, is like, you don't have to be stuck in this. So by, yes, giving your grief a voice, sharing your story is one thing, but not moving yourself forward by not having, like, you got to take some initiative. By not doing anything, you are only suffering more. And my thought
even
is,
to a greater extent, because you're re-traumatizing yourself quite accurately and articulately.
Yes. And so my thought is, you're already suffering. You might as well suffer and move your feet. You might as well suffer and be doing something to move you forward. And so I definitely see that in the online space today. It's like, in-person support groups have moved online. No one's moving forward. Everyone's perpetuating their own story, living in their own story over and over and over and over and over. They feel better because they're getting support, they're getting sympathy, they're getting empathy from people. But yet,
all the things they probably want,
likes and comments. And so it's I think it's just a recipe for keeping people stuck. I really do.
And then with that keeping stuck, then story becomes part of their identity.
Yes, you live into that. You become a martyr, of your own grief. It's like, well, I guess, stakes in the ground. This is just my life. And, that's a sad place to
move on now because this is me.
Yes, absolutely. Especially there's certain kinds of losses where I see that more so, especially like the case of suicide. If you lose someone by suicide, it's really, the loved ones might identify themselves as a suicide survivor. That's heartbreaking for me when I hear that. It really is.
That label perpetuates something.
Yeah.
So when you're working with clients, I think one of the questions I had was about, is there a natural process that we go through? But then earlier you were saying about, time heals all wounds. Doesn't. So therefore, and given what we've just spoken about, is that, you've got to move your feet in this. What are some of the things you actually do with your clients to help them move through this journey? Probably, I wouldn't say the word better, but probably with a bit more ease and grace, shall we say?
Yeah. So grief recovery I can offer it both in person and online. And online, it's a 7-week program. So that at the start of this, 7 weeks from now, you will have worked through the hardest loss of your life. You will have emotionally addressed what is incomplete for you. And It is an evidence-based proven method for moving through grief. It is evidence-based. Kent University did a study on this, and it's in the publication phase. It is the only evidence proven method for moving through grief, and it just works. I have losses that people have experienced that I know have gone through the program. Actually, one of the she's a trainer. She's not a trainer. She's like head of marketing of the Institute. She was on my podcast actually, so I can share this, but she was a victim of sexual assault by her own father and her uncle in a cult-like manner.
Right.
Religion was used against her. Satanic, like ritualistic type stuff. She became a meth addict, and grief recovery is the one thing that helped her, is the thing that helped her. And she does what I do. And it has helped people in all walks of life, no matter the loss, no matter how the time frame, whether it was, I've had clients that I've walked through this 3 months after the death of a loved one. Myself, it was over 30 years. And it's never too late and it's never too soon. And what we do is we walk you through in a supported, guided way, working through emotionally what is incomplete.
Yeah.
In a structured way. And again, that at the start of it, it's 7 weeks. So you're not going to go to the support group for 12 years.
Yeah.
Saying the same story. Yes. Yeah. And I've heard people, I've heard stories of people who have shared that, like, they never want to go to another support group again because someone introduced themselves and said, well, I've been coming here for 7 years or 12 years or whatever, however many years. And they'll walk out and be like, I never want to, this is not for me. I don't want to be here. I don't want to be coming here for 7 years. That's not life. That's not living.
No.
When you're stuck in that story of what happened, it's not moving you forward. So this is an action educational program. It's education and it's action.
And
what it's phenomenal.
Yeah, it is, because we've highlighted how poor we are at this at the best of times, and even probably even if we were a bit more empathetic, it's still struggling around in the dark, if you know what I mean. So to have a process that someone can gracefully take you through, so that we can at least get to a place of stability at the end of it, is kind of makes sense, really.
People might say too, it's like there's no cookie cutter, one size fits all method, right? But what's different about this is that it is individualized to you and to your loss. So that's why it's not based on any religion. It's nothing like that. It is individual to you. And I think that's why it really works the way it does.
And so what are some of the steps that we go through during the 7 weeks?
Well, the first few weeks is actually education. It's a lot of education. And that alone helps people understand their grief, kind of connect the dots to what's been happening in their life throughout the years or recent, or it really, and it always has tied back to somehow something in their childhood. It always does. Always. Because we learn these things as children. And so education is the first part of it. And then we move into the steps, which talks about, we get into apologies, we get into forgiveness, which is huge. That's a big stumbling block for so many people, especially in an instance of abuse. And I was sexually abused as a child. So that was really difficult for me to, but we have a process for doing that.
Mm.
It's nothing that's pushed, there's always a way to work through that. And so that's why this method is actually outlined in a book. It's the Grief Recovery Handbook. I
Mm.
encourage anybody to read it, but you can't go through this alone. And that's
No.
the thing. Like, we do not work through this stuff on our own. I tried.
Yeah.
I got the book. I read it. I tried.
Oh,
No, it
really?
doesn't, nope, it's not gonna work.
Yeah.
So yeah, you do need someone who is trained that can
Yeah.
help you,
Mm.
because
So
oftentimes too, like a big part of, like, I'm a heart with ears. That's what we call in grief recovery. And for many of us, we don't have that in our lives
mm,
because the people closest to us are often the heart with ears in your life is probably not going to be someone who has skin in your game
yeah.
of life. So many of us don't have that person that can just listen without analysis, criticism, or judgment. And
Mm.
that's really the foundation of grief recovery, is you actually experience that, probably for many the first time in their life.
Mm. Mm. I guess on one level, it's kind of sad that we don't have these people like yourself just interwoven into community anyway. Do you know what I mean? As opposed to having to find people out and commercially interact with them. Do you get what I mean?
Mm-hmm. But I bring my empathy. Empathy is my number one strength, actually, and I bring that to my life and everyday interactions, I feel like. And
Mm.
so there's all kinds of healers and helpers out there. You don't have to have a credential of a grief recovery specialist to
Mm.
show empathy or compassion to people. But my point in saying this is that, or what I want to highlight is that I feel like, and what I've personally learned is that we cannot sit with others in their pain if we have not been able to sit in our own.
Mm. Mm.
We help others to the extent that we have helped ourselves.
Mm. Otherwise, you're just going to get triggered, and then
Exactly.
you're not
Bingo.
any use to anybody.
And that is why we are so many of us are uncomfortable with other people's grief, because of what it brings up for us.
Mm. Mm. Mm.
And we don't know what to say. We don't know how to respond. We don't know what to do. All of these things.
Yeah. Yeah. So you're saying with the method that there's the education, there's the forgiveness. What are the other key components over the journey?
It really is about you take these action steps to work through apologies and forgiveness, and it's really diving into what is emotionally incomplete.
Right.
That's really but it's expressing it with someone who's hearing it without criticism, analysis, or judgment.
Mm.
And that's why it just doesn't work with just anybody.
Yes. Yeah.
Because you're always going to have somebody, if you what often happens is people try and share about what's happening with them, and then either I've this is why I started my podcast, to be honest, like the
Yeah.
education of grief. And so people can share their story without analysis, criticism, and
Yes.
judgment.
Yes.
And
Openly and publicly.
yes, and the feedback I've gotten is that, wow, that was really therapeutic.
Yeah.
Like, because they actually felt heard, right? They felt heard without someone trying to like fix them, or,
I get the same with this podcast.
yeah, it's just listen,
Mm. Well,
we just don't
interesting.
have the skills. God gave us two ears and one mouth for a reason.
Very true. Interestingly, a previous guest, Dr. Bill Saunders, who's been one of the Western Australia's leading clinical psychologists, particularly when it comes to alcohol and drug addiction. And he recently came back on the podcast and he said, you know, you can boil all the techniques down, but ultimately it's about being in close proximity with someone and listening to them and asking them what happened.
What happened? Thank you for bringing that up. I just got goosebumps because that's kind of been the running theme lately in the work that I'm doing in the podcast interviews I've shared recently, is the idea that people are so overly medicated that no one asks what happened to you. And let's just put a pill on the symptoms and let's not address what's really going on. Like, let's not address, let's pull the weed from the root.
Yeah.
You know, instead of putting like Roundup on it, you know. That's how I get really fired up about this. So I'll try and like simmer down, but I do, because it happened to me. It's this idea of when you go to get help, there isn't a conversation about what happened to you. There just isn't. It's what are your symptoms? Okay, you're depressed. You feel depressed. You're having a depressive mood. You know, I was molested as a child. My dad died when I was a child, and my relationship with my mom is a train wreck. So, you know, I just had 2 babies. I'm having postpartum. Like, what else do you want? You know, okay, well, just take this pill and everything will be fine. No, that doesn't happen. That's not reality. And for a lot of people too, talk therapy alone isn't going to help either. Because you can talk therapy is like going to the support group for 12 years, right? Are you taking action? No? Well, then you'll probably continue with talk therapy for the rest of your life, right? Unless you take action. So I do get fired up about this.
Really? Is that right?
I do. It's like, and again, I actually had someone on my podcast who was bipolar, undiagnosed for like 20 some years. And he said bipolar is the illness of loss. And he lost everything. He was living in a shack, sleeping on a mattress, living in a cabin and with nothing else in it but a mattress. And he was at the end of his rope in a life. And he said, but someone with bipolar is not going to go in to see the doctor and get help when they're manic. They're going to go in when they're depressed.
Correct.
And unless that physician is doing a diagnostic assessment of everything, of all the symptoms, of everything, of history, like family history of bipolar, family history of mental illness, the one thing he taught me was that if that physician puts someone who is bipolar on an antidepressant without a mood stabilizer, that will send them into a manic state. And I could not, that is one thing that I was like, why is this not being like screamed from the rooftops? Like, why is this not, this is what sets people into a manic state who are bipolar, undiagnosed. When they go to the doctor because they're depressed, they get put on a pill without a mood stabilizer because the proper screening was not done. And when you can go to a nurse practitioner, which I did, to get an antidepressant, why is that even possible? Like, that should not even be possible. Like, we should leave that to psychologists and psychiatrists to, I don't know, whichever one. There's one of those can prescribe, one can, I think. I'm not sure, but yes, thank you.
Yeah.
You know,
that's when you get into the scary world.
It is. That's why we have so many people addicted to heroin, because they couldn't get they couldn't get their antidepressants anymore, or you know, they went to so many doctors they couldn't get them filled, because now that, oh, look what we created, this opioid crisis in the United States now, oh, let's back up then the prescriptions, and now they're taking heroin. Now they're on heroin or fentanyl, or you know, I've had so many guests say the very same thing. Like a child, how many children are put on antidepressants and meth-like drugs? I had the one podcast episode I just aired not long ago. He was put on a meth-like drug when he was 8. 8 years old for ADHD. For ADHD, and he was acting out. Okay. He was gay. His mom was deaf, and he was being bullied.
Go figure.
He was a grieving child. And you know what? He's not on anything right now. Like, he's not on antidepressants anymore. Like, because he's been doing a lot of inner work and therapy and EMDR and all these other things. I'm saying there's alternatives to drugs, but that is usually the quick fix, you know.
Coming out of the drugs.
Sorry.
I'm bringing you down for a minute.
It's just a tragedy. It's a tragedy.
No, it is. You know, and I guess, you know, one of the questions I like to ask my guests, but I think you've already done it, is what is it like to know what you know and then look into the world, you know, outside of it? And I think you've just given me the answer to that.
Heartbreaking.
Indeed. But so as I was going to say, coming out of the drugs for a minute, do you find that with your clients, you know, once we've gone through this period of almost navigating your way through the overwhelm, the emotional part of it, do they get to a almost like an existential questioning point where it's like, whoa, I'm not here for that long. What is this about? You know, once the overwhelm has subsided, that's when I find these openings to these bigger questions, which can cause another realm of overwhelm But how do they have that? How do you help them navigate that part? Because that's really interesting as well, that bit.
It is the side effect. It's the side effect, I think, of actually working through your crap, is seeing yourself and the world more clearly. Really. And so it's like, yeah, what do I want to do with the rest of my life? Like, because when we start to come back to home, to ourselves, within ourselves, I can speak for myself, is, like I said, I didn't even know my own potential because I was so wrapped up in this victim story, and I couldn't see the forest through the trees, right? I couldn't see what was possible. And so, yeah, a side effect of working through my stuff is like, oh my God, this whole world of possibility opened up for me. I'd never experienced a Reiki session in my entire life. I got Reiki level 1 and 2 certified because I just I was more open to my own intuition. I kept hearing Reiki. I'm like, what the heck is Reiki? Which is energy healing, by the way, if you're not sure. And so I followed that curiosity, and it led me I went through all the training. I became a Reiki master. But it's been the one modality that's helped support the grief recovery work that I do, because I need to make sure that I'm filling my cup.
Oh yeah.
So it's, you know, supporting me in the work that I do, so I can be there fully for the clients I work with and for my podcast guests. And, you know, because I've actually had people say to me, I'm really concerned about you, you know, because empathy is my number one strength. And how are you protecting your energy? Like, that has to be really depressing, you know, hearing people's stories but it's learning to know what's mine and what's not, right?
Yeah.
But I think for the general public, again, I think that's the byproduct of working through your stuff, is you start to see yourself more clearly in others.
And then I find that being able to stay in a conversation means that, because you're not getting triggered, means that you can open up a connection at a far more exciting level, which means that what to the outsider looks like, oh, that looks like some heavy shit. I come away from it sometimes going, that was like so life reaffirming.
Yes, it opens us up to deeper connection, just exactly what you said. And then we start to think about maybe our spirituality and our faith and we start to question all these things. And if you're open to being open, you'll receive guidance and intuitive messages, and and all of these strengthen over time as long as we nurture them within us, I think.
Do you ever look at, obviously we've talked very much around the individual. If we start chunking that out now to groups, to nationalities, to countries, to is it possible to take the lens of how we individually process and move through grief and then apply it to groups?
I think there are culturally are certain ways that groups of people may view grief, or may not work through it, or I think even overall just how we have this death aversion, like we are so afraid of death. And I think just over the years, I've actually read something a few months back about how society itself, like here in the States anyway, our ancestors before would actually remain with the dead for several days, take pictures with the dead. The family was very much involved in the dying process and the grieving process and the funeral preparation and everything like that. And we've, over time, throughout the years, we've really separated ourselves from that experience of that process of a funeral or the process of dying. And so I think that's only created more of this isolation.
I can see that, as in, there used to be, from what you're saying and from what I understand, there used to be like almost entrenched cultural rituals, which have now been outsourced to undertakers.
Yes.
And more
and I think that has an impact on how we grieve. Actually,
now we're isolating it and outsourcing it as opposed to distributing it.
Yeah, and we distance ourselves, right? And that's one thing I got from my end of life doula training is,
which is what we do with so many things.
Yes.
In our weird world, weird being Western educated, industrialist, rich democracy. We outsource things, whether it's extraction, whether it's violence, whether it's, as opposed to distributing it amongst ourselves.
Yeah, and I think too, we have to understand that individually we impact and we have ripples of our actions and our words and our thoughts, even our energy, and we have an impact. And I don't think we understand our impact that we have on the impact we have on people. It isn't until like our eulogy and after we die, people are talking about our impact, the impact that we had on them, right? And I think that's, if we lived our lives like, I have an impact, like what I do matters, what I say matters. If we became more conscious about that, it trickles out, whether it's in our communities, our neighborhoods, our groups of people. And it adds to this collective, I'll say, vibrational energy that we bring to the world. So I do think it starts as an individual, but it ripples out. That's why it matters. That's why it matters to work through your crap.
Yeah.
Because you have an impact.
Yeah. And that impact could be, if you've not, attended to your wounds, you'll just carry on bleeding all over everybody.
Yes. There's your quotable right there.
Yeah. Oh, you can't pin that on me. I think I've read it. and following from what you were saying, I read, I can't remember who wrote it, that you go back a couple of generations time, you've got people would happily and openly talk about death, but not money. Now, people happily talk about money, but not death.
Yeah. Yeah.
And so the importance of a higher authority of the market increases over life and death.
Yeah.
And yeah, it was interesting because when I considered this conversation and I was thinking about the societal level of it, I was going towards this, we're very much moving towards this beautification and stuff like that. But in this discussion of what you've just brought up with, being with the dead, taking pictures with the dead, I realized that we've actually slayed some of our symbols and rituals around this, which help to maintain knowledge within them, an understanding that remains in the culture for us to access. Does that make sense?
Yeah. Yeah. And again, I think it comes back to like, what do we want to pass on to the next generation? What do we want the next generation to be like? And I think it's people speaking up about these taboo topics that help to create the change that just helps to bring more understanding to something that is really misunderstood.
Yeah. Yeah. I really enjoyed this conversation. It's been...
I got a little spirited. I'm sorry.
No. That's good. I like it. It's called WA Real for a reason. Do you think we've covered most of the area?
I think so. Do you have any questions? Any other questions?
No, I only have one more question, but that's my final closing question at the best of times. But, I've certainly enjoyed going all across the terrain, as it were.
Can I ask you a question?
For sure.
So what was did you have any aha moments of what I shared about grief?
I think there's a couple of things. Starting with the backpack, but then also linking it to the lack of emotional literacy. So I shared some of them, but then I think the biggest one was the one that we just picked up on a minute ago, about the fact that we have taken rituals out of our culture, and hence, and I guess, and what I'm about to say, I don't say it in any way to offend, but in a strange kind of way, you are providing a service, and having to do it commercially, because it's no longer within our communities and in our society, if you get what I mean. Because the skills, the reverence, the rituals, the symbols have been taken out and taken out and taken out. Yet this is still a very human response that, no pills, no uploading to Facebook or Google is ever going to get rid of, because we're human beings and this is how we do life. And so, where before there would at least be some sort of support mechanism and something via the medium of rituals and symbols, and a reverence, a degree of reverence for the cycle of life and death, with that being swept away and swept away and swept away and swept away, we're at this sort of strange place where, in order to healthily process my grief, I have to reach out and go and pay for a service, the same as I might have to get my car serviced. And I'm not being demeaning to you by any stretch of the imagination, but it's kind of a weird and wacky world that we're heading towards, where you're now a specialist in an area that by rights should be woven into our community. And does that make sense?
Yes, bingo. You've connected the dots. You've connected the dots because of how we've gotten here, right? Of how we've gotten to where we are. And the interesting thing,
quite a bit of time thinking about systems and complex systems and how we've got to.
Well, and me just going through my end of life doula training versus the experience I actually had with the passing of my father, because he had cancer and he was in a nursing home. And it brings me great sadness to know that he could have had a different experience.
Yeah.
The last of his days could have been so much different. He could have been empowered to make decisions that were what he desired.
Yeah.
We could have been more involved as a family, because an end of life doula helps the dying create their end of days.
Yes.
What legacy do you want to leave? How do you want to go out of this world? Do you want your family and loved ones to wash your body? Like, that never even occurred to me until I got my training. Like, was that even possible? Like, so many people don't even think that's possible, you know, to really have this last loving gesture for their loved one.
Yeah.
And so it really helps, doulas help to bridge the gap between the medicalization.
Yes.
This is the thing too. I'll circle back to that, but families don't know that they have the option to really, and even those dying, that it could be different. Like, it doesn't have to be this way, you know? But how we medicalize death and dying, we medicalize grief.
Like we do birth.
Right. Even like but we medicalize dying in that, you know, let's do the scans, let's, you know, do the chemo, let's do all these things, even though the doctor may know it's not going to change the outcome. So instead, this person is spending their last of their life in a hospital bed when they could be in hospice, where their symptoms are managed, but yet they can stay lucid enough to actually have a conversation with their loved ones and experience an end of life experience that is really a completion of their life in a beautiful way. Like, that's possible. And so many people don't think that is. Now, of course, in an instance of a car accident or something tragic, that isn't possible. And I actually thought, I want to go quick. I don't know what's happening, you know. But my end of life doula training, actually, it's not that I wish for cancer, but if I'm given the opportunity to choose how I go out, and I can give my loved ones a beautiful experience of my end of days to share with me, that does a lot for their bereavement. That's one thing I've learned is if we can stop medicalizing dying and death and get back to and grief, like with the pills, you know, let's quit medicalizing grief. We would be a better society for it.
And you can extend that back to birth, which is apparently one of our first areas of grief.
I actually just heard a story yesterday. A woman was sharing on social media about she had a really traumatic cesarean. Her first child was a cesarean, a C-section birth, and she really wanted a VBAC, you know, vaginal birth after a cesarean. And the hospital was like, nope, too risky. Your babies are too big. You're too small. It's too risky. She changed hospitals, hired a birth doula, and had her VBAC. But had she listened to this, you know, what they were telling her, you know, she went with her intuition, she went with what she wanted. It was a beautiful experience that she had, you know. So I think no one knows you better than you. But at the same time, when you're full of grief, it's really hard to know what you need and what you need. But ruminating in the story is not going to help you.
No, as we discussed earlier on.
Yeah.
So the last question I like to ask all my guests, and it's a hypothetical one, which I enjoy the answer to, is if I can just slow down the whole world for 10 minutes and and I would allow you, Victoria, to upload one single question into the collective consciousness, so everyone just sat down quietly and thought about it for 10 minutes, what would that be?
Whew, that's a good question. Can I get back to you on that?
No.
Oh, man. Wow. That's a profound question. I love that. What does your heart need to say?
There you go.
What does your heart say?
That just comes straight up for you.
Yeah. Because I think we really don't take the time to connect with our hearts. It's all up in logic.
Up in cognitive world.
Yep. What's yours?
Oh, I got asked that in the last podcast. See,
Well, then you should have an answer.
The last podcast guest, who as well was from the US, decided that he'd flip it right around onto me to give himself some space to think about it.
But I answered first.
Yeah. So what's mine today? How are you choosing life today?
It's a good one.
Particularly given the topic of conversation that we've had. How are you choosing life? You know, instead of what we were talking about earlier on when you were saying, like, you know, someone's a suicide survivor or something like that, you know, it's the away from, it's what you're going towards. Why choosing life?
I have another one, actually, and I think this comes back to, though,
I don't normally let guests have two, but go on. This said it.
Oh, it is good. If you had 1 year to live, how would you live your life today? It's kind of piggybacking yours, but yeah, if you had 1 year to live, how would you want to spend it? What would you do differently? Okay, that's like 10 questions.
But yeah, I can see where you're going with it.
Yeah.
Victoria, I've thoroughly enjoyed this conversation.
So have I. Thank you so much.
Yeah, it's been a lot of fun. And if people want to reach out and connect, where can they find you?
My website, theunleashedheart.com. I have all the links to everything on there. On social media, I'm at The Unleashed Heart on Instagram. And my podcast is Grieving Voices.
Victoria, thank you so much for your time. I've super enjoyed it.
Thank you.